In the grand halls of Bertram's hotel, a scream shatters the elegance, and a man lies dead, poisoned. Was it the nervous maid hiding a secret vial? The heiress missing her diamond bracelet? Or the polished manager with a ticking pocket watch? As clues pile up, a torn napkin, a cufflink in the garden, a cryptic note, Miss Jane Marple unravels a web of lies. Who's hiding the truth? And what deadly secrets lurk behind the hotel's perfect facade? Chapter 1. The arrival at Bertram's hotel. In the heart of London, where the hustle of modern life seemed to pause, Bertram's hotel stood as a relic of a bygone era. Its polished brass fittings gleamed under the soft glow of gaslit chandeliers, and its oak-panelled walls whispered of secrets kept since the Edwardian age. To the casual observer, it was a haven of elegance, a place where the upper crust sipped tea and discussed matters of little consequence. But beneath the veneer of civility, a quiet tension simmered, unnoticed by all save one sharp-eyed guest. Miss Jane Marple, with her soft white shawl draped over her shoulders and her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, sat in a high-backed chair in the hotel's grand lounge. Her eyes, bright and bird-like, darted from one guest to another, taking in every gesture, every glance. She had arrived at Bertram's that morning, drawn not by the promise of luxury, but by a curious letter from an old friend, Lady Beatrice Sedgwick, who had hinted at something peculiar afoot in the hotel. Miss Marple, ever attuned to the undercurrents of human behaviour, had accepted the invitation with her usual blend of curiosity and caution. The lounge was a study in contrasts. At one table, Colonel Reginald Bantry, retired and ruddy-faced, recounted tales of his military days to a bored young heiress, Miss Clara Winthrop, whose diamond bracelet caught the light with every impatient flick of her wrist. Nearby, Mr. Ernest Caldwell, a solicitor with a pinched face and nervous hands, scribbled notes in a leather-bound ledger, occasionally glancing toward the entrance as if expecting someone. Across the room, Mrs. Lavinia Harcourt, a widow of considerable wealth, sipped her tea while her companion, Miss Evelyn Grey, a mousy woman in her 30s, hovered attentively. At the far end, the hotel's manager, Mr. Humphrey Weston, moved with practised grace, ensuring every guest felt attended yet unobserved. Miss Marple's needles paused as she noted the time. 3:47 p.m., October 12th, 1955. The clock above the fireplace ticked with mechanical precision, its rhythm a counterpoint to the murmur of conversation. She had been watching the guests for hours, cataloguing their habits. Colonel Bantry always stirred his tea 3 times clockwise. Miss Winthrop's left hand strayed to her bracelet whenever Mr. Caldwell looked her way. Mrs. Harcourt's smile never reached her eyes, and Miss Grey's deference seemed tinged with resentment. Mr. Weston, for all his charm, had a rare habit of checking his pocket watch when he thought no one was looking. It was then that the scream pierced the air. It came from the direction of the private dining room, a sharp, desperate cry that silenced the lounge. Heads turned, teacups froze mid-air, and Mr. Weston's smile faltered. Miss Marple's needles stilled, her gaze narrowing as a young maid, pale and trembling, stumbled into the lounge. "Help!" the maid gasped. "It's Mr. Pennington! He's dead!" A ripple of shock passed through the room. Colonel Bantry stood, his chair scraping against the floor. Miss Winthrop's bracelet clattered as her hand flew to her mouth. Mr. Caldwell's pen froze, ink blotting his ledger. Mrs. Harcourt set down her teacup with a clink, while Miss Grey's eyes widened, her fingers clutching her skirt. Mr. Weston, recovering his composure, strode toward the maid. "Calm yourself, Mary," he said firmly. "Take us to him." The guests followed, a reluctant procession with Miss Marple trailing at the rear, her knitting tucked into her bag. The private dining room was a small, elegant space, its table set for one. Slumped in a chair, his face ashen and his eyes staring blankly, was Mr. Arthur Pennington, a wealthy financier known for his ruthless business dealings. A glass of wine lay spilled across the table, its contents staining the white cloth a deep crimson. A faint smell of almonds hung in the air. Miss Marple's eyes swept the scene. The single place setting, the untouched plate of roast beef, the overturned glass, the window slightly ajar, and the faint smudge of mud on the carpet near the door. She noted the time again, 3:52 p.m., and the position of Mr. Pennington's hands, one clutching a napkin, the other resting limply by his side. Colonel Bantry, assuming command, barked, "No one touch anything! This is a matter for the police." Miss Winthrop whispered to no one in particular, "Poison, surely, that smell." Mr. Caldwell, his voice tight, muttered, "He had enemies, many enemies." Mrs. Harcourt, her tone icy, said, "A tragedy, but hardly surprising. Men like Pennington make their own fate." Miss Grey, trembling, said nothing, her eyes fixed on the body. Mr. Weston, ever the professional, sent the maid to fetch the police and instructed the guests to return to the lounge. As they filed out, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze lingering on the smudge of mud. It was fresh, she noted, and oddly out of place in the pristine room. She also observed a small, crumpled piece of paper under the table, half hidden by the tablecloth. She made no move to touch it, but her mind catalogued its presence. Back in the lounge, the atmosphere had shifted. The guests sat in uneasy silence, their earlier politeness replaced by suspicion. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly, but her mind was far from idle. She thought of Lady Beatrice's letter, which had mentioned a shadow over Bertram's. She thought of the guests, each with their secrets, and of Mr. Pennington, whose death had torn the veil of civility from the hotel. As the police arrived, led by the gruff Inspector Davis, Miss Marple watched their brisk efficiency with mild amusement. They would measure, photograph, and question, but they would miss the subtleties. The glance, the gesture, the word unspoken. That was her domain, the quiet observation of human nature. "Miss Marple," Colonel Bantry said, approaching her, "you've a knack for these things, haven't you? What do you make of it?" She smiled faintly, her eyes twinkling. "Oh, Colonel, it is far too early to say. But I suspect Mr. Pennington's death is not the end of this affair, but the beginning." The inspector began his questions, calling each guest in turn. Miss Marple listened, her needles moving steadily as alibis were given and motives hinted at. Colonel Bantry had been in the lounge all afternoon, as had Miss Winthrop. Mr. Caldwell claimed to have been in his room, working on legal documents, though no one could confirm it. Mrs. Harcourt and Miss Grey had been together in the garden until moments before the scream. Mr. Weston had been overseeing the staff, though he admitted to stepping into his office briefly at 3:30 p.m. Miss Marple noted the times, the contradictions, the hesitations. She thought of the mud, the paper, the smell of almonds. She thought of the guests, their faces, their lies, and she knew, with the certainty of her little grey cells, that Bertram's hotel held more secrets than it seemed. As the clock struck 5 p.m., she leaned back, her knitting resting in her lap. The game, as her old friend would say, was afoot. Chapter 2. The Shadow of Suspicion. The lounge at Bertram's hotel, so recently a haven of genteel calm, had transformed into a stage of unease. The guests sat in clusters, their voices hushed, their eyes darting to one another with poorly concealed suspicion. The police, under Inspector Davis's brisk command, had cordoned off the private dining room, and the air buzzed with the low hum of official activity. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her corner with her knitting, appeared to be the only one untouched by the tension, her needles clicking rhythmically as she observed the scene with her usual quiet acuity. Inspector Davis, a man of square shoulders and a no-nonsense demeanour, had set up a makeshift office in the hotel's library, where he was now questioning each guest in turn. His assistant, Sergeant Finch, stood by the door, notebook in hand, scribbling furiously. The inspector's approach was methodical, but heavy-handed, and Miss Marple noted with a faint smile that he seemed more interested in facts than in the subtler currents of human behaviour. The clock above the fireplace read 6:15 p.m., October 12th, 1955, when Colonel Bantry was called in first. He returned after 20 minutes, his face flushed, muttering about damned impertinence. Marple's needles paused as she overheard him confide to Miss Winthrop, "The man thinks I had reason to dislike Pennington. Ridiculous. We barely spoke, though I'll admit he was a bit of a bounder." Miss Winthrop, her diamond bracelet glinting as she twisted it nervously, replied in a low voice, "He was dreadful to me once, you know. Tried to pressure me into selling my family's estate, but I'd never—" Her voice trailed off as she caught Miss Marple's gaze, and she quickly turned away. Next came Mr. Caldwell, the solicitor, whose interview lasted a mere 10 minutes. He emerged pale, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his tie. Miss Marple noted the faint ink stain on his cuff, a detail she had not observed earlier. He sat alone, avoiding eye contact, his ledger now closed and clutched tightly to his chest. Mrs. Harcourt and Miss Grey were questioned together, a decision that seemed to irritate the widow. "Really, Inspector," Mrs. Harcourt said as she returned, her voice carrying across the lounge, "must we be treated like common criminals? Evelyn and I were in the garden, as I told you. We saw nothing, heard nothing, until that dreadful scream." Miss Grey nodded mutely, her eyes downcast, but Miss Marple noticed the slight tremor in her hands, as if she were suppressing some deeper emotion. Mr. Weston, the hotel manager, was the last to be questioned. He emerged unruffled, his smile as polished as ever. Though Miss Marple detected a faint tightening around his eyes, he approached her directly, his tone deferential. "Miss Marple, I understand you have a reputation for insight. If there's anything I can do to assist, you have only to ask." She smiled, her eyes twinkling. "You are most kind, Mr. Weston. I am merely an old woman who notices things. But tell me, do you always keep such a close eye on your pocket watch?" His smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "A habit, I'm afraid. A manager must keep time." "Indeed," she said softly, her needles resuming their rhythm. "Time is often the key to many things." As the evening wore on, the police released preliminary findings. Mr. Pennington had been poisoned, likely by cyanide, which accounted for the almond-like smell. The wine was the probable source, though the bottle had been removed by the time the police arrived, likely by a staff member in the confusion. The window, slightly ajar, suggested a possible entry or exit point, though the smudge of mud on the carpet remained unexplained. The crumpled paper under the table had been retrieved. A torn fragment of a letter, bearing only the words "must act soon" in a hurried scrawl. Inspector Davis addressed the guests in the lounge, his voice clipped. "Until we have more answers, no one is to leave the hotel. We'll need your cooperation. Mr. Pennington's death was no accident, and someone in this room knows more than they're saying." A murmur of protest rose, but Miss Marple's attention was elsewhere. She was thinking of the alibis, each so neatly presented, yet so curiously incomplete. Colonel Bantry and Miss Winthrop had been in the lounge, but could they vouch for every moment? Mr. Caldwell's solitary work in his room was unverified. Mrs. Harcourt and Miss Grey's garden stroll seemed convenient, and Mr. Weston's brief absence at 3:30 p.m. coincided suspiciously with the time of death, estimated between 3:30 and 3:50 p.m. She also considered the motives. Mr. Pennington, she had learned from snippets of conversation, was a man who wielded power ruthlessly. Colonel Bantry had clashed with him over a business deal years ago. Miss Winthrop's estate had been a target of his financial schemes. Mr. Caldwell, as a solicitor, might have handled Pennington's affairs, or his enemies. Mrs. Harcourt's cold remark about Pennington's fate hinted at a personal grievance, and Miss Grey's silence suggested more than mere shyness. Even Mr. Weston, with his impeccable manners, might have reasons to wish Pennington gone, perhaps tied to the hotel's finances. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Lady Beatrice Sedgwick, her old friend, who swept into the lounge with an air of aristocratic authority. Her silver hair was impeccably styled, her eyes sharp despite her advanced years. She made a beeline for Miss Marple, her voice low but urgent. "Jane, I knew you'd come," she said, taking the chair beside her. "This business with Pennington, it's what I feared. There's something wrong here, something deeper than a single murder." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression serene. "My dear Beatrice, you mentioned a shadow in your letter. Perhaps you might share a little more." Lady Beatrice hesitated, glancing around the lounge. Not here, but Pennington was involved in something unsavory. I overheard him last week, speaking of a deal that would ruin someone. He was in the library, on the telephone, and he didn't know I was there. He mentioned a name, Harcourt. Miss Marple's needles paused, though her face remained impassive. "Harcourt, you say? Most interesting. And did he say anything else?" "Only that it had to be done quickly. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now—" Lady Beatrice's voice trailed off, her eyes troubled. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. "The fragment of the letter, 'must act soon,'" echoed Lady Beatrice's words. Was it Pennington's writing, or someone else's? And why Harcourt? Mrs. Harcourt's wealth made her a likely target for Pennington's schemes, but her cold demeanour suggested she was no victim. As the evening drew to a close, the guests retired to their rooms under police supervision. Miss Marple remained in the lounge, her knitting a pretext for lingering. She watched as Mr. Weston checked the windows, his movements precise but hurried. She noted Miss Grey's hesitation at the staircase, as if reluctant to follow Mrs. Harcourt. She saw Mr. Caldwell slip a small object, perhaps a key, into his pocket as he left. The clock struck 9 p.m., and the lounge fell silent. Miss Marple gathered her knitting, her mind a tapestry of clues and questions. The mud, the paper, the wine, the alibis, all pieces of a puzzle that she was certain would reveal a pattern. She thought of her village, St. Mary Mead, where human nature was no different, only writ smaller. Here, in the grand confines of Bertram's hotel, the stakes were higher, but the game was the same. As she ascended the stairs to her room, she murmured to herself, "The little grey cells, they are already at work, and they will not rest until the truth is found." Chapter 3. The Intricate Web of Alibis. The morning of October 13th, 1955, dawned grey and heavy over Bertram's hotel, the sky outside its tall windows a mirror to the mood within. The lounge, though still elegant, felt stifled by the weight of suspicion that had settled overnight. The guests, confined to the hotel by Inspector Davis's orders, moved with a restless unease, their conversations stilted, their glances guarded. Miss Jane Marple, seated once more in her corner with her knitting, seemed an island of calm amid the storm, her eyes bright and watchful as she catalogued every detail of the scene before her. Breakfast had been a tense affair, served in the main dining room under the watchful eye of Sergeant Finch. Colonel Bantry had grumbled about the coffee, his usual bluster subdued. Miss Clara Winthrop, her diamond bracelet conspicuously absent, picked at her toast, her face pale and drawn. Mr. Ernest Caldwell, his ledger now nowhere in sight, sat alone, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. Mrs. Lavinia Harcourt and Miss Evelyn Grey shared a table, the widow's imperious tone cutting through the room, as she complained about the inconvenience of their confinement. Miss Grey, as ever, said little, though Miss Marple noted the way her eyes flicked toward Mr. Weston, who moved among the tables with his usual polish, ensuring the service remained impeccable. Miss Marple's thoughts were occupied by the events of the previous evening and the fragments of information she had gathered. The crumpled paper with the words "must act soon" nagged at her, as did Lady Beatrice's mention of Mr. Pennington's telephone conversation. The name Harcourt was a thread she could not yet place, but she sensed it was central to the mystery. The smudge of mud on the carpet, too, was a puzzle, fresh, out of place, and suggesting someone had entered or left the dining room through the window. But why, when the hotel's corridors offered easier access? At 9:15 a.m., Inspector Davis summoned the guests to the lounge for a briefing. His face was grim, his notebook filled with scribbled details. "We've had the preliminary report from the coroner," he announced, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Mr. Pennington died of cyanide poisoning, administered through the wine he drank. The bottle, unfortunately, is still missing, but we're searching the premises. The time of death is narrowed to between 3:30 and 3:45 p.m. yesterday. I'll need each of you to account for your whereabouts during that window." A ripple of unease passed through the room. Colonel Bantry cleared his throat. "As I said, Inspector, I was here in the lounge, chatting with Miss Winthrop. We didn't budge." Miss Winthrop nodded, though her voice was hesitant. "Yes, we were discussing the weather, I believe, from about 3 o'clock until the scream at 3:47. Miss Marple's needles paused. She recalled Miss Winthrop's restless fidgeting with her bracelet, and the way Colonel Bantry's eyes had wandered toward the dining-room door. Could they truly vouch for every minute? Mr. Caldwell spoke next, his voice tight. I was in my room, working. I didn't leave until I heard the scream. I'm afraid I was alone, so I've no one to confirm it. Mrs. Harcourt's lips curled slightly. Evelyn and I were in the garden, as I told you. We returned to the lounge just before the maid's outburst. The garden path is visible from the terrace. Surely someone saw us. Miss Grey nodded, her voice barely audible. We were together the whole time. Mr. Weston, standing by the fireplace, added smoothly, I was overseeing the staff, as I mentioned. I stepped into my office briefly at 3:30 to review the day's accounts, but I was back in the main hall by 3:40. Inspector Davis scribbled in his notebook, his brow furrowed. We'll verify these alibis. In the meantime, we've found no fingerprints on the glass, which is curious. Whoever handled it was careful. And that mud on the carpet, it's from the garden, but no one admits to tracking it in. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. The mud, she thought, was no accident. Someone had been careless, or perhaps deliberately misleading. She made a mental note to examine the garden path later, weather permitting. As the briefing concluded, Miss Marple decided to take a more active role. She approached Inspector Davis, her manner deferential but firm. Inspector, might I have a word? I wonder if I could see the dining room again. Sometimes an old woman's perspective notices what others miss. Davis, clearly sceptical but unwilling to offend, nodded. Very well, Miss Marple, but don't touch anything. Accompanied by Sergeant Finch, Miss Marple returned to the private dining room. The body had been removed, but the scene was otherwise untouched. The overturned glass still lay on the table, the crimson stain now dried into the cloth. The window remained ajar, and the smudge of mud was still visible on the carpet. Miss Marple knelt carefully, her joints protesting, and examined the smudge. It was not a footprint, but a streak, as if something had been dragged across the floor. She glanced at the window, noting its low sill and the view of the garden beyond, a secluded path lined with roses, partially hidden from the terrace. Her eyes then fell on the table. The napkin Mr. Pennington had clutched was still there, crumpled but undisturbed. She leaned closer, careful not to touch it, and noticed a faint stain on its edge. Not wine, but something darker, perhaps ink. She thought of Mr. Caldwell's stained cuff and the missing wine bottle. A pattern was forming, though it was still incomplete. As she straightened, Sergeant Finch coughed politely. Find anything, Mum? Oh, nothing of consequence, she said lightly, though her mind was racing. Just an old woman's curiosity. Back in the lounge, Miss Marple sought out Lady Beatrice, who was sipping tea by the window. Beatrice, my dear, she said, settling beside her, you mentioned Mr. Pennington's conversation. Did you hear anything else? A tone, perhaps, or another name? Lady Beatrice frowned, her memory straining. He was agitated, I recall. He said something about the papers being ready and no more delays. I thought it was business, but now I wonder. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking. Papers, she thought. Could they be connected to the crumpled note? And why was Pennington so insistent on haste? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden commotion at the entrance. Mary, the maid who had discovered the body, was speaking rapidly to Mr. Weston, her face pale. Miss Marple strained to hear, catching fragments. Found it, in the pantry, didn't know what to do. Mr. Weston hurried to Inspector Davis, and soon the lounge was abuzz again. The missing wine bottle had been found, tucked behind a stack of linens in the pantry. It was empty, its label smudged but legible, and it bore traces of cyanide. The discovery raised more questions than answers. Why hide the bottle in such an odd place? And why was it empty? Miss Marple's mind turned to the staff. Mary, the maid, had been distraught, but was her panic genuine? Mr. Weston's calm efficiency seemed almost too perfect, and his brief absence at 3:30 p.m. was still unaccounted for. She resolved to speak with Mary later, perhaps under the guise of offering comfort. As the day wore on, the guests grew more fractious. Colonel Bantry argued loudly with Mr. Caldwell over a trivial matter, their voices carrying across the lounge. Miss Winthrop, now wearing a simple gold bangle instead of her diamond bracelet, seemed on the verge of tears. Mrs. Harcourt's imperious demeanour faltered briefly when she caught Miss Grey staring at Mr. Weston, and Miss Marple noted the flash of anger in the widow's eyes. By 3 p.m., Miss Marple decided to take a walk in the garden, hoping to examine the path. The rain had held off, leaving the ground damp but firm. She followed the rose-lined path, noting its seclusion from the terrace. Near the end, she found a patch of disturbed earth, as if someone had stepped off the path into the flower bed. A faint trace of mud matched the smudge in the dining room. She bent down, her eyes sharp, and spotted a small object half buried in the soil. A cufflink, silver, with the initials EC. Her heart quickened, but she left the cufflink untouched, marking its location in her mind. Ernest Caldwell, she thought, or perhaps a clever misdirection. As she returned to the lounge, the clock struck 4 p.m. The guests were gathered again, their faces a mix of fear and defiance. Inspector Davis was outlining his next steps, but Miss Marple's attention was elsewhere. The cufflink, the mud, the note, the ink stain, all were threads in a web that was growing ever more intricate. She thought of her village, where a misplaced glance or a careless word could unravel a mystery. Here, in Bertram's hotel, the stakes were higher, but the principles were the same. She resumed her knitting, her needles a steady rhythm, and murmured to herself, "The truth is there, if only one looks closely enough." Chapter 4. The Threads of Motive. The afternoon of October 13th, 1955, cast a pall over Bertram's hotel, where the elegance of its decor seemed at odds with the growing unease among its occupants. The lounge, with its plush armchairs and gleaming silver tea service, remained a stage for suspicion, each guest a player in a drama that grew darker by the hour. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual corner, her knitting needles moving with mechanical precision, observed the shifting dynamics with her sharp, bird-like eyes. The discovery of the wine bottle and the cufflink had tightened the web of clues, but the pattern remained elusive, like a half-remembered tune. Inspector Davis, ever diligent, had intensified his interrogations, summoning guests for second interviews in the library. His focus, Miss Marple noted, was on the physical evidence, the cyanide, the missing bottle, the mud, but he seemed less attuned to the subtler currents of human motive. She, however, was piecing together a tapestry of secrets, each thread a gesture, a word, a glance that betrayed more than the speaker intended. At 4:30 p.m., Miss Marple decided to seek out Mary, the maid who had found Mr. Pennington's body. She found her in the service corridor, folding linens with a distracted air. Mary's hands trembled slightly, and her eyes darted nervously as Miss Marple approached, her manner gentle and disarming. "My dear," Miss Marple said, her voice soft, "you've had quite a shock. Might I have a word? I find a chat often soothes the nerves." Mary hesitated, then nodded, leading Miss Marple to a small alcove near the pantry. "It's been awful, ma'am," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Finding Mr. Pennington like that. I can't stop seeing his face." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, her eyes noting the girl's pale complexion and the way her fingers twisted the edge of her apron. "It must have been dreadful. Tell me, Mary, did you notice anything unusual before you found him? Perhaps in the dining room, or with the guests?" Mary's eyes flickered with uncertainty. I don't know, ma'am. I was clearing tables in the main dining room most of the afternoon. But I did see Mr. Caldwell near the private dining room around 3:25. He looked agitated, like he was in a hurry. And then there was the bottle. I swear I didn't touch it until I found it in the pantry. Miss Marple's needles, tucked in her bag, seemed to click in her mind. "Mr. Caldwell, you say? And where was Mr. Weston at the time?" Mary frowned, thinking. "He was in the hall, I think, but he went to his office just after I saw Mr. Caldwell. I didn't think much of it then, but now—" "Thank you, Mary," Miss Marple said, patting her hand. "You've been most helpful." As she returned to the lounge, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the cufflink with the initials EC, Ernest Caldwell's nervous demeanour and unverified alibi made him a compelling figure. But she knew better than to leap to conclusions. The cufflink could be a plant, a deliberate misdirection to cast suspicion. She needed more threads to weave the truth. At 5 p.m., the lounge buzzed with the return of Colonel Bantry, who had been re-questioned by Inspector Davis. His face was redder than usual, his voice carrying as he spoke to Miss Winthrop. "The inspector's got it in for me, Clara. Keeps harping on about that old business with Pennington. A failed investment, nothing more. I didn't hold a grudge." Miss Winthrop, her gold bangle catching the light, replied softly, "He was ruthless, Colonel. You weren't the only one he crossed. My family's estate. He nearly ruined us." Miss Marple's ears pricked up. She recalled Miss Winthrop's diamond bracelet, so prominent yesterday but absent today. Had it been pawned, perhaps to cover debts incurred by Pennington's schemes? Or was it hidden, a clue to something more sinister? Mrs. Harcourt, seated nearby, overheard the exchange and interjected with a cold smile. "Mr. Pennington was a predator, my dears. I warned Evelyn about him months ago, when he tried to meddle in my late husband's investments. Men like that invite trouble." Miss Grey, at her side, flushed and looked away, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Miss Marple noted the tension between the two women, a dynamic she had not fully grasped. Was Miss Grey's deference to Mrs. Harcourt genuine, or a mask for resentment? Mr. Weston approached, his smile as polished as ever. "Tea, Miss Marple. We must keep up appearances, even in such trying times." She accepted the cup, her eyes meeting his. "You manage so well, Mr. Weston. It must be difficult, with such a tragedy under your roof. Did you know Mr. Pennington well?" His smile tightened. "Only as a guest, I'm afraid. He was particular but generous with his tips. A complicated man." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind on the manager's brief absence at 3:30 p.m. His office was near the private dining room, close enough to slip in unnoticed. She thought of the mud, the window, the missing bottle. Someone had been careful, but not careful enough. Her musings were interrupted by a sudden outburst. Mr. Caldwell, who had been sitting silently, stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is intolerable," he snapped, his voice shaking. "I'm a solicitor, not a criminal. I had no reason to harm Pennington." The room fell silent, all eyes on him. Inspector Davis, who had just entered, raised an eyebrow. "No one's accused you, Mr. Caldwell, but if you've something to say, now's the time." Caldwell's face paled, and he sat down, muttering, "I've said enough." Miss Marple's needles would have clicked, had they been in her hands. Caldwell's outburst was revealing, not in what he said, but in what he didn't. She thought of the ink stain on his cuff, the cufflink in the garden, the crumpled note. Papers, Lady Beatrice had said. Could Caldwell have been involved in Pennington's deal? As the evening approached, Miss Marple decided to explore the hotel's library, where Pennington had made his mysterious phone call. With Inspector Davis's permission, she entered the quiet room, its shelves lined with leather-bound volumes. The telephone sat on a small table, its receiver gleaming in the lamplight. She examined the area, noting a faint scratch on the table's edge, as if something heavy had been dragged across it. Nearby, a wastebasket held a few scraps of paper, one bearing a partial phone number. Only 3 digits, but enough to suggest a local exchange. She left the library, her mind buzzing. The phone call, the note, the name Harcourt. All pointed to a scheme that Pennington had been orchestrating, one that had cost him his life. But who had felt threatened enough to act? Mrs. Harcourt with her wealth and cold demeanour? Caldwell with his nervous hands and hidden papers? Or someone else lurking in the shadows of Bertram's hotel? At 7 p.m, the guests gathered for dinner, their appetites subdued. Miss Marple watched as Miss Grey hesitated before sitting beside Mrs. Harcourt, her eyes darting to Mr. Weston, who was overseeing the service. Colonel Bantry, trying to lighten the mood, began a story about his military days, but it fell flat. Miss Winthrop excused herself early, claiming a headache, and Mr. Caldwell ate in silence, his eyes fixed on his plate. As the meal ended, Miss Marple caught a glimpse of Mary slipping into the service corridor, a small bundle in her hands. Curious, she followed at a distance, her steps soft on the carpet. Mary entered the pantry, and Miss Marple peered through the cracked door. The maid was unwrapping the bundle, a small vial, its label obscured. Mary glanced around, then tucked it into her apron and hurried away. Miss Marple's heart quickened. A vial. Could it be connected to the cyanide? She made a mental note to speak with Mary again, but carefully, so as not to alarm her. As she returned to the lounge, the clock struck 8 p.m. The guests were dispersing, their faces weary. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind a whirl of motives and clues. The cufflink, the vial, the note, the mud, all were pieces of a puzzle that was beginning to take shape. She thought of her village, where a careless word or a hidden grudge could unravel the most complex schemes. Here, in the grand confines of Bertram's, the players were more polished, but their hearts were just as human. She murmured to herself, "The truth is, like a skein of wool, one must pull gently but firmly to untangle it." Chapter 5. the red herrings. The evening of October 13th, 1955, settled over Bertram's hotel like a heavy fog, the air thick with unspoken accusations. The lounge, though still a picture of elegance, seemed to pulse with the tension of secrets held too tightly. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting a constant companion, sat in her familiar corner, her eyes scanning the room with the quiet intensity of a hawk. The discovery of the vial in Mary's possession had added a new thread to the intricate web of clues. But Miss Marple knew better than to let it distract her. In her experience, the most obvious clues were often the least reliable, red herrings designed to mislead the unwary. Inspector Davis, undeterred by the growing restlessness among the guests, had announced that he would focus his investigation on Mr. Ernest Caldwell, whose unverified alibi and nervous demeanour made him a prime suspect. The cufflink found in the garden, bearing the initials EC, had only strengthened the inspector's resolve. Miss Marple, however, suspected that Caldwell's apparent guilt was too convenient. A carefully placed distraction from the true culprit. She had seen such tactics before, in the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead, where a dropped handkerchief or a staged argument could obscure the truth. At 8:30 p.m., the guests were summoned to the lounge for an update from Inspector Davis. His face was stern, his notebook clutched tightly as he addressed the group. "We've made progress," he said, his voice carrying a note of triumph. "The cufflink found in the garden has been identified as belonging to Mr. Caldwell. We've also learned that Mr. Pennington was involved in a legal dispute with Mr. Caldwell's firm, one that threatened to ruin him financially. Mr. Caldwell, I'd like you to come with us for further questioning." Caldwell's face drained of colour, his hands trembling as he stood. "This is outrageous," he stammered. "I lost that cufflink weeks ago. And yes, Pennington was a client, but I had no reason to kill him. The dispute was settled." Colonel Bantry, his military instincts roused, interjected, "Now see here, Inspector, you can't just accuse a man on such flimsy evidence. That cufflink could have been planted." Miss Winthrop, her voice trembling, added, "Mr. Pennington was a beast, but Mr. Caldwell's not the type. He's too nervous to commit murder." Mrs. Harcourt's lips curled in a faint smile. "Nervous men can be dangerous, my dear, especially when cornered." Miss Grey said nothing, her eyes fixed on the floor, but Miss Marple noted the way her hands clenched in her lap, as if suppressing a reaction. Mr. Weston, standing by the fireplace, maintained his polished calm, though his fingers brushed his pocket watch, a gesture Miss Marple had come to recognize as a sign of unease. As Caldwell was led away, protesting, Miss Marple's mind turned to the vial she had seen Mary hide. She needed to speak with the maid again, but discreetly, lest she frighten her into silence. She also considered the cufflink. If it was indeed Caldwell's, how had it ended up in the garden? And why was it so conveniently placed near the path leading to the dining room window? At 9 p.m., Miss Marple found an opportunity to speak with Mary, catching her in the service corridor as she carried a tray of tea things. "Mary, my dear," she said, her tone gentle, "I couldn't help but notice you seemed troubled earlier. That vial you had, might it have something to do with this dreadful business?" Mary's eyes widened, and she nearly dropped the tray. "Oh, ma'am, it's not what you think. It was just medicine for my headaches. I didn't want Mr. Weston to see, 'cause he doesn't like us keeping personal things in the pantry." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained kind. "Of course, my dear, but you must be careful. In times like these, even innocent things can be misunderstood." Mary nodded, her face flushed, and hurried away. Miss Marple was not convinced by the girl's explanation. The vial's label had been obscured, and Mary's panic suggested more than a simple headache remedy. Could it be cyanide, or something else entirely? She resolved to keep a closer eye on the maid. Returning to the lounge, Miss Marple overheard a heated exchange between Mrs. Harcourt and Miss Grey. "Evelyn, you must stop this foolishness," Mrs. Harcourt said sharply, her voice low but audible. "Your distractions are unbecoming. Focus on your duties." Miss Grey's face reddened, and she murmured, "I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean—" Mrs. Harcourt cut her off with a wave of her hand. "Enough. We'll discuss this later." Miss Marple's needles would have clicked had they been in her hands. The tension between the two women was palpable, and Miss Grey's distractions seemed to centre on Mr. Weston. Was there a romantic entanglement, or something more sinister? She recalled Lady Beatrice's mention of Pennington's phone call, and the name Harcourt. Could Miss Grey, so quiet and unassuming, be hiding a deeper connection to the crime? At 10 p.m., Miss Marple decided to revisit the garden, hoping to find more clues near the spot where the cufflink was found. The night was cool, the path dimly lit by lanterns. She moved carefully, her eyes scanning the ground. Near the rose bed, she noticed a faint indentation in the soil, as if someone had stood there for some time. Nearby, half hidden by a leaf, was a small shred of fabric, dark blue, possibly from a coat or dress. She left it untouched, noting its position for Inspector Davis. As she returned to the hotel, she encountered Mr. Weston locking the terrace doors. "A late stroll, Miss Marple?" he asked, his smile as smooth as ever. "Merely clearing my thoughts," she replied, her eyes meeting his. "The garden is lovely, though I wonder about that path. It seems well-trodden, doesn't it?" His smile didn't waver, but his hand lingered on his pocket watch. "The staff use it often, I'm afraid. It's the quickest way to the service entrance." Miss Marple nodded, filing away his response. The path was secluded, not a likely route for staff unless they sought privacy. She thought of the mud, the cufflink, the fabric. Someone had been in that garden, and not by accident. Back in the lounge, the guests were subdued, their earlier energy drained by Caldwell's detention. Colonel Bantry approached Miss Marple, his voice low. "You've got a sharp mind, Miss Marple. Do you think Caldwell's guilty? Seems too obvious to me." She smiled faintly. "In my experience, Colonel, the obvious is rarely the truth, but every clue tells a story, if one listens carefully." As the clock struck 11 p.m., Miss Marple retired to her room, her mind a whirl of possibilities. The cufflink pointed to Caldwell, but its placement felt staged. The vial in Mary's possession was suspicious, but her fear seemed genuine. The tension between Mrs. Harcourt and Miss Grey hinted at hidden motives. And Mr. Weston's calm was too perfect, his absence at 3:30 p.m. too convenient. The shred of fabric, the note, the phone call, all were pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit neatly. She thought of Lady Beatrice's words about a shadow over Bertram's. Pennington's death was no isolated act, but part of a larger scheme. She recalled the partial phone number in the library wastebasket, the scratch on the table, the ink on the napkin. Each detail was a thread, and she was determined to weave them together. As she settled into her chair, her knitting in her lap, she murmured, "The red herrings are many, but the truth is singular, and I shall find it." Chapter 6. A Clue in Detail. The morning of October 14th, 1955, broke with a thin drizzle that cloaked Bertram's hotel in a veil of mist, lending an air of melancholy to its grand facade. Inside, the lounge retained its polished elegance, but the atmosphere was heavy with the strain of confinement and suspicion. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual corner, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm, watched the guests with a keen eye. The events of the previous day, the cufflink, the vial, the shred of fabric, had deepened the mystery, and she sensed that a single detail, properly understood, might unravel the entire affair. Inspector Davis, his patience wearing thin, had doubled down on his focus on Mr. Ernest Caldwell, who remained in custody for further questioning. The cufflink, with its damning initials, and Caldwell's financial ties to Mr. Pennington, had made him the prime suspect in the inspector's eyes. Miss Marple, however, was not convinced. The evidence was too neat, too perfectly placed, like a stage prop in a village play. She had seen such diversions before, and her little grey cells were restless, seeking the subtle inconsistency that would point to the truth. At 9 a.m., Miss Marple decided to revisit the private dining room, hoping to examine the scene once more, before the police altered it further. With Sergeant Finch's reluctant permission, she entered the room, now eerily quiet without the bustle of investigation. The table remained as it had been, the crimson-stained cloth undisturbed, the napkin still crumpled where Mr. Pennington had clutched it. The window still ajar let in a damp breeze, and the smudge of mud on the carpet seemed more pronounced in the morning light. Miss Marple knelt carefully, her eyes drawn to the napkin. The faint ink stain she had noticed before was clearer now, a smudge of dark blue, not unlike the ink on Mr. Caldwell's cuff. But it was the shape of the stain that caught her attention. A small, irregular mark, as if a pen had been pressed too hard and then dragged. She leaned closer, careful not to touch, and noticed something else, a tiny, almost imperceptible tear in the napkin's edge, as if it had caught on something sharp. Her mind flashed to the library, where she had found the partial phone number and the scratch on the table. Could the napkin have been torn there, perhaps during a struggle or a hurried exchange? She made a mental note to check the library again, focuser on the table's edge. As she stood, Sergeant Finch cleared his throat. "Anything of interest, Miss Marple?" "Oh, just an old woman's fancies," she replied, her tone light but her eyes sharp. "But details, Sergeant, are often the key to understanding." Returning to the lounge, Miss Marple observed the guests who were gathered for breakfast under the watchful eye of Mr. Weston. Colonel Bantry, his usual bluster subdued, was reading a newspaper, though his eyes kept drifting to the door where Inspector Davis had last appeared. Miss Clara Winthrop, still without her diamond bracelet, sipped her tea with a distracted air, her gold bangle catching the light. Mrs. Lavinia Harcourt and Miss Evelyn Grey sat together, but the widow's sharp tone was absent, replaced by a strained silence. Miss Grey's eyes, Miss Marple noted, lingered on Mr. Weston, who moved among the tables with his usual grace, though his hand brushed his pocket watch more frequently than before. At 10:15 a.m., Miss Marple sought out Lady Beatrice Sedgwick, who was seated by a window, her expression troubled. "Jane," Lady Beatrice said as Miss Marple approached, "this business grows darker by the day. I've been thinking about that phone call I overheard. Pennington mentioned papers and Harcourt, but there was something else. A name, I think. It was Grey, perhaps? Or was it Green? My memory isn't what it was." Miss Marple's needles paused, though they were in her bag. "Grey, you say? That is most intriguing. And his tone? Was it angry? Urgent?" "Urgent," Lady Beatrice replied, her brow furrowed. "As if he were giving orders, but also afraid. It's hard to explain." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The name Grey connected directly to Miss Evelyn Grey, whose quiet demeanour and tense relationship with Mrs. Harcourt had already piqued her interest. Could Pennington's scheme have involved Miss Grey? Or was the name a coincidence? She thought of the shred of fabric in the garden, dark blue, like the coat Miss Grey often wore. Another thread, perhaps, but one that needed careful handling. Her thoughts were interrupted by a commotion at the lounge entrance. Inspector Davis strode in, his face grim, holding a small evidence bag. "We've found something new," he announced, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "A key, discovered in the pantry near where the wine bottle was hidden. It's a room key, number 204, Mr. Caldwell's room." A gasp rippled through the room. Colonel Bantry lowered his newspaper, his eyes narrowing. Miss Winthrop's teacup clattered in its saucer. Mrs. Harcourt's lips tightened, and Miss Grey's hands clenched in her lap. Mr. Weston, for the first time, seemed momentarily off balance, his hand frozen on his watch. "Caldwell's already in custody," Davis continued, "but this strengthens our case. The key was hidden deliberately, suggesting he had something to conceal. We'll search his room immediately." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. A key, she thought, was a curious find. Why hide it in the pantry, so near the wine bottle? And why Caldwell's room key, when he claimed to have been in his room at the time of the murder? It was another red herring, she suspected, designed to keep the inspector's focus on the solicitor, while the true culprit slipped further into the shadows. She decided to visit the library again, hoping to confirm her suspicions about the napkin. The room was quiet, the telephone table untouched since her last visit. She examined the scratch on the table's edge more closely, noting its jagged shape, as if a sharp object, a ring perhaps or a pen, had been dragged across it. The partial phone number in the wastebasket was still there, and she memorized the 3 digits, 7-4-2, knowing they might lead to a crucial connection. As she left the library, she encountered Miss Grey, who was hurrying down the corridor, her face pale. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, startled. "I was just looking for a book." "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple replied, her tone kind but her eyes searching. "The library's a comforting place, isn't it? Though I find the telephone table rather scratched. Do you know how it might have happened?" Miss Grey's eyes widened, and she stammered, I wouldn't know. I rarely use the library." She hurried away, her blue coat brushing against the wall. Miss Marple's mind clicked like her needles. The coat, the fabric, the name Grey in Lady Beatrice's memory, all were converging. She thought of the napkin's tear, the ink stain, the scratch. Had Miss Grey been in the library during Pennington's call, perhaps overhearing or even interrupting it? And if so, what had she heard or done? At noon, Miss Marple joined the guests for lunch, her presence unassuming, but her observations relentless. Colonel Bantry was quieter now, his earlier defence of Caldwell tempered by the new evidence. Miss Winthrop, her bangle glinting, avoided eye contact, her thoughts seemingly elsewhere. Mrs. Harcourt's imperious air had returned, but her glances at Miss Grey were sharp, almost accusing. Mr. Weston, ever the perfect host, seemed distracted, his eyes lingering on the clock. As the meal ended, Miss Marple overheard a snippet of conversation between two maids in the corridor. "Mary's been acting strange," one whispered. "Ever since she found that bottle, she's been jumpy. And that vial, did you see how she hid it?" Miss Marple's heart quickened. She needed to speak with Mary again. But first, she wanted to see Caldwell's room before the police search altered it. With a discreet word to Sergeant Finch, she gained permission to accompany the search, posing as a curious bystander. Room 204 was tidy, almost too tidy, with Caldwell's legal papers neatly stacked on the desk. But Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to a small wastebasket, where a torn piece of paper caught her attention. It bore a single word, "Harcourt," in the same hurried scrawl as the note found under the dining room table. She left it for the police, but her mind was racing. The note, the key, the cufflink, all pointed to Caldwell. But the pattern felt orchestrated, as if someone were weaving a false narrative. As she returned to the lounge, the clock struck 2 p.m. The guests were restless, their alibis fraying under scrutiny. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind a whirl of details. The napkin's tear, the library scratch, the fabric in the garden, the vial, the name Grey. Each was a clue, small but significant, and she knew that one properly understood would unlock the truth. She murmured to herself, "The smallest detail, like a stitch dropped in knitting, can unravel the entire pattern, and I am very close to finding it." Chapter 7. More Lies Surface. The afternoon of October 14th, 1955, draped Bertram's hotel in a quiet unease, the drizzle outside mirroring the clouded atmosphere within. The lounge, with its polished wood and soft lamplight, seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the next revelation to shatter its fragile calm. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her corner with her knitting, observed the guests with her usual acuity, her needles clicking softly as her mind wove together the threads of the mystery. The napkin's tear, the library scratch, the shred of fabric, and the name Grey had deepened her suspicions, but she knew that the truth often lay hidden, beneath layers of deception, waiting to be uncovered by a careful hand. Inspector Davis, emboldened by the evidence against Mr. Ernest Caldwell, had returned from searching room 204 with a triumphant air. The discovery of the torn paper bearing the word Harcourt had further convinced him of Caldwell's guilt, and he was preparing to press the solicitor for a confession. Miss Marple, however, saw the mounting evidence as a carefully constructed facade, designed to obscure the real culprit. In her experience, lies were like shadows, cast by the truth but distorted, and she was determined to find the source of the light. At 2:30 p.m., Miss Marple decided to speak with Miss Clara Winthrop, whose absence of her diamond bracelet and nervous demeanour suggested a hidden story. She found the young heiress in the conservatory, a glass-walled room filled with potted ferns, where she sat alone, twisting her gold bangle. Miss Marple approached with her usual gentle air, her knitting bag in hand. "Miss Winthrop," she began, settling into a wicker chair, "you seem troubled, my dear. This dreadful business must be weighing on you." Clara's eyes flickered with unease, but she managed a weak smile. "It's just all so shocking, Miss Marple. Mr. Pennington's death, and now poor Mr. Caldwell being blamed. It's too much." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, though they remained in her bag. "Indeed, it is a terrible affair. I couldn't help but notice your lovely diamond bracelet yesterday. So striking, yet you're not wearing it today. Is there a story behind it?" Clara's hand froze on her bangle, her face paling. "It's being cleaned," she said quickly, her voice barely steady. "The clasp was loose, so I sent it to the jeweler." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes kind but searching. "Of course, my dear. Though I recall Mr. Pennington took an interest in your family's estate. Did he ever mention your bracelet, perhaps as collateral?" Clara's lips trembled, and for a moment it seemed she might break. He did pressure me," she admitted, her voice low. "He wanted the estate, said it was a sound investment. I refused, but he was relentless. He even suggested I sell my jewellery to cover debts I didn't have. But I'd never hurt him, Miss Marple, I swear." Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "I believe you, my dear, but secrets, even small ones, can complicate matters. If you know anything more, it's best to share it." Clara hesitated, then shook her head. "There's nothing else. I want this to be over." As Miss Marple left the conservatory, her mind turned to Clara's words. The missing bracelet was no coincidence, she suspected. Perhaps pawned to cover financial troubles caused by Pennington's schemes, or hidden to avoid suspicion. She made a mental note to inquire about local jewellers, though discreetly. At 3:15 p.m., the lounge buzzed with a new development. Inspector Davis had released Mr. Caldwell, citing insufficient evidence for an arrest, though he remained under suspicion. Caldwell returned to the lounge, his face haggard, his tie askew. He avoided the other guests, sitting alone and staring at his hands, which still bore the faint ink stain Miss Marple had noted earlier. Colonel Bantry approached him, his voice gruff but kind. "Chin up, Caldwell. The inspector's barking up the wrong tree. Pennington had enemies aplenty. Doesn't mean you did it." Caldwell's eyes darted up, his voice bitter. "Enemies, yes, but I'm the ones with my cufflink in the garden and my key in the pantry. Someone's trying to ruin me." Miss Marple's ears pricked up. Caldwell's outburst confirmed her suspicion that the evidence against him was planted, but by whom? She thought of the shred of fabric, dark blue, like Miss Grey's coat, and the tension between Miss Grey and Mrs. Harcourt. Could one of them be orchestrating a frame? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp exchange at the far end of the lounge. Mrs. Harcourt, her voice icy, was addressing Miss Grey, who stood with her head bowed. "Evelyn, your carelessness is unforgivable," Mrs. Harcourt said, her words carrying across the room. "I trusted you to handle my correspondence, and now I hear you've misplaced important letters. What were you doing in the library yesterday?" Miss Grey's face flushed and she stammered, I was only fetching a book, ma'am. I didn't touch your letters." Mrs. Harcourt's eyes narrowed. "Don't lie to me, Evelyn. I know you were there during Mr. Pennington's call. What did you hear?" The room fell silent, all eyes on the two women. Miss Grey's hands trembled, and she seemed on the verge of tears. "I didn't hear anything, ma'am. I swear it." Miss Marple's mind raced. Mrs. Harcourt's accusation confirmed Lady Beatrice's story about the phone call, and Miss Grey's presence in the library was no coincidence. The scratch on the table, the torn napkin, the name Grey, all pointed to a moment of confrontation or eavesdropping. Had Miss Grey overheard something incriminating, or was she involved in Pennington's scheme? Mr. Weston, ever the mediator, stepped forward. "Ladies, perhaps this is best discussed privately. The police will handle matters." Mrs. Harcourt shot him a cold glance. "Stay out of this, Mr. Weston. My affairs are my own." Miss Marple noted the manager's fleeting discomfort. his hand brushing his pocket watch. His calm was a mask, she suspected, hiding something deeper. She thought of his absence at 3:30 p.m., so close to the time of the murder, and his claim that the garden path was used by staff. Was he protecting someone, or himself? At 4 p.m., Miss Marple decided to speak with Mary again, hoping to clarify the matter of the vial. She found the maid in the pantry, polishing silver with a distracted air. "Mary," Miss Marple said gently, "I don't mean to pry, but that vial you had, it's been troubling me. If it's medicine, there's no harm in showing it to the police, is there?" Mary's eyes widened, and she clutched the polishing cloth tightly. "It's nothing, ma'am, I swear. Just something personal. I didn't want trouble." Miss Marple's tone remained kind but firm. "My dear, in a murder investigation, everything matters. If you're hiding something, it's better to share it now than to be found out later." Mary's lips quivered, and she reached into her apron, producing the vial. It was small, its label partially scratched off, but Miss Marple could make out the word sedative. "It's for my nerves," Mary whispered. "I've been so anxious, what with Mr. Pennington and all. I didn't want Mr. Weston to know. He's strict about us keeping things proper." Miss Marple examined the vial, her eyes narrowing. A sedative was innocent enough, but the scratched label and Mary's secrecy raised questions. Could it have been tampered with? Or was it another distraction? She handed it back, saying, "Thank you, Mary. You've done the right thing." As she returned to the lounge, Miss Marple overheard Colonel Bantry speaking to Miss Winthrop. "I saw Weston in the hall just before the scream," he said, his voice low. "He was carrying a tray. Odd for a manager, don't you think?" Miss Winthrop nodded, her bangle glinting. "He's always so proper, but yes, it's strange. And Evelyn, she's been acting so oddly since yesterday." Miss Marple's needles would have clicked, had they been in her hands. A tray, she thought. Could it have held the poisoned wine? And Miss Grey's behaviour, her fear, her glances at Weston, suggested a connection that was growing clearer. By 6 p.m., the guests gathered for dinner, their faces weary. Mrs. Harcourt's accusation had left Miss Grey subdued, her eyes avoiding everyone. Caldwell, though released, sat alone, his expression haunted. Colonel Bantry tried to lighten the mood with a story, but it fell flat. Miss Winthrop excused herself early, and Mr. Weston, overseeing the service, seemed distracted, his eyes on the clock. As the meal ended, Miss Marple caught a glimpse of Miss Grey slipping into the service corridor. Curious, she followed at a distance, her steps soft. Miss Grey entered the library, and Miss Marple peered through the cracked door. The young woman was rifling through a drawer, her movements frantic. She pulled out a small envelope, glanced around, and tucked it into her coat. Miss Marple's heart quickened. The envelope. Could it be the papers Pennington had mentioned? She made a mental note to inform Inspector Davis, but carefully, so as not to alert Miss Grey. As she returned to the lounge, the clock struck 7 p.m. The lies were surfacing, each one a thread in the tapestry of deception. The torn napkin, the scratched table, the fabric, the vial, the envelope, all pointed to a truth that was tantalizingly close. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind a whirl of connections, and murmured, "The lies are many, but the truth is patient. It will reveal itself in time." Chapter 8. The Emotional Turning Point. The evening of October 14th, 1955, cloaked Bertram's hotel in a restless quiet, the drizzle outside softening to a faint mist that blurred the edges of the world beyond its windows. The lounge, with its warm lamplight and polished surfaces, seemed to hold its breath. as if sensing the mounting tension among the guests. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her corner with her knitting, felt the shift in the air, a subtle change like the moment before a storm breaks. The envelope Miss Grey had hidden, the lies surfacing among the guests and the mounting evidence against Mr. Caldwell had brought the mystery to a critical juncture. Miss Marple knew that someone under pressure would soon reveal a truth that could unravel the entire affair. The guests confined to the hotel for the third day were growing frayed, their polite facades cracking under the strain of suspicion. Colonel Bantry's usual bluster had given way to a brooding silence, his eyes fixed on the fireplace. Miss Clara Winthrop, her gold bangle a poor substitute for her missing diamond bracelet, fidgeted nervously, her gaze darting to the door. Mr. Ernest Caldwell, released but still under scrutiny, sat alone, his hands clasped tightly, the ink stain on his cuff a constant reminder of his precarious position. Mrs. Lavinia Harcourt's imperious demeanour had softened, replaced by a guarded watchfulness, while Miss Evelyn Grey, her face pale, avoided everyone's eyes, especially those of her employer. Mr. Weston, ever the consummate manager, moved among them with his polished smile. But Miss Marple noted the tension in his shoulders, the frequent glance at his pocket watch. At 7:30 p.m., Inspector Davis gathered the guests in the lounge for another update, his face weary but determined. "We've searched Mr. Caldwell's room thoroughly," he announced, his voice firm. "We found documents linking him to Mr. Pennington's financial dealings, papers that suggest a motive for murder, but we're not done yet. Someone in this hotel knows more than they're saying, and I intend to find out who." A murmur of unease rippled through the room. Caldwell's voice broke the silence, sharp and desperate. "Those papers are old business. Pennington's deals were settled months ago. I'm being framed, I tell you." Colonel Bantry, roused from his brooding, snapped, "Enough, Caldwell! If you're innocent, stop acting so guilty. It's making us all jumpy." Miss Winthrop's voice trembled as she added, "This is unbearable. We're all suspects, aren't we? I can't stand it any longer." Mrs. Harcourt's lips tightened, but she said nothing, her eyes fixed on Miss Grey, who seemed to shrink under her gaze. Mr. Weston stepped forward, his tone soothing. "Please, everyone, let's remain calm. The inspector will get to the bottom of this." Miss Marple's needles paused, though they remained in her bag. She sensed the moment was near, a crack in the facade, a moment of weakness that would reveal a vital truth. She decided to press gently, choosing Miss Grey as her target. The young woman's fear, her secretive actions in the library, and the mention of her name in Pennington's phone call suggested she was a key to the puzzle. At 8 p.m., Miss Marple found Miss Grey in the conservatory, standing alone among the ferns, her blue coat draped over a chair. The young woman's hands were clasped tightly, her face drawn. Miss Marple approached with her usual gentle air, her knitting bag a comforting prop. "Miss Grey," she began, her voice soft, "you seem terribly distressed, my dear. This dreadful affair must be weighing heavily on you. Sometimes sharing a burden can lighten it." Miss Grey's eyes widened, and for a moment she seemed on the verge of flight, but something in Miss Marple's kind gaze held her in place. I don't know what to say, Miss Marple," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's all so awful." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes searching but gentle. "Indeed it is. I couldn't help but overhear Mrs. Harcourt's words earlier about the library and Mr. Pennington's call. You were there, weren't you? Did you hear something that frightened you?" Miss Grey's hands trembled. and tears welled in her eyes. "I didn't mean to eavesdrop," she said, her voice barely audible. "I was in the library fetching a book for Mrs. Harcourt when I heard Mr. Pennington on the telephone. He was angry, talking about papers and a deal that would finish Harcourt. I didn't understand it all, but he mentioned my name, said I was in the way. I was so scared I hid behind the shelves until he left." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her expression remained serene. "And did you tell anyone what you heard, my dear?" Miss Grey shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "No, I couldn't. Mrs. Harcourt. She'd be furious if she knew I was listening. And Mr. Weston, he's been kind to me, but I didn't want to involve him. I thought if I stayed quiet, it would all go away." Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "You've been very brave, my dear, but secrets can be dangerous, especially now. Did you see anything else that day? Perhaps in the dining room or the garden?" Miss Grey hesitated, her eyes darting to her coat. I was in the garden earlier, before the stream. I saw Mr. Weston there, near the rose bed. He seemed to be looking for something. I didn't think much of it then, but now?" Miss Marple's mind clicked like her needles. The shred of fabric, the cufflink, Mr. Weston's presence in the garden, all were converging. She thought of the tray Colonel Bantry had mentioned, and the manager's absence at 3:30 p.m. Could Weston be more involved than he appeared? "Thank you, Evelyn," Miss Marple said softly. "You've done the right thing by telling me. Now try to rest, and leave this to the police, and to me." As Miss Grey hurried away, wiping her tears, Miss Marple returned to the lounge, her mind racing. Miss Grey's confession was a turning point, a crack in the wall of lies that surrounded the murder. Pennington's mention of Harcourt and Grey suggested a scheme that threatened both women, but the details remained elusive. The shred of fabric, likely from Miss Grey's coat, placed her in the garden, but Weston's presence there was more troubling. Had he dropped the cufflink to frame Caldwell, or was he searching for something else? At 9 p.m., Miss Marple approached Inspector Davis, her manner deferential but firm. "Inspector, I've had a word with Miss Grey, and she's shared something important. She overheard Mr. Pennington in the library, speaking of a deal involving Mrs. Harcourt and mentioning her own name. It might be worth looking into." Davis's brow furrowed, but he nodded. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I'll speak with her. But we're still focused on Caldwell. Those papers in his room are damning." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Of course, Inspector, but sometimes the loudest clues are the least true." As the evening wore on, the guests gathered for a late tea, their faces etched with exhaustion. Colonel Bantry, trying to rally the group, began a story about his military days, but it faltered under the weight of the room's tension. Miss Winthrop, her bangle glinting, seemed distracted, her eyes on Caldwell, who sat alone, his head bowed. Mrs. Harcourt, her composure restored, spoke little, but her glances at Miss Grey were sharp, almost predatory. Mr. Weston, overseeing the tea service, was as polished as ever, but Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his hand as he poured. At 10 p.m., a new development shook the lounge. Sergeant Finch burst in, holding a small evidence bag. "Inspector, we found this in the garden, near the rose bed," he said, his voice urgent. "It's a ring, a woman's ring, with an inscription." Davis took the bag, his eyes narrowing as he read the inscription aloud. "To E.G., with love." The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Miss Grey, who gasped and clutched her hand, where a bare finger betrayed the ring's absence. I lost it days ago," she stammered, her face ashen. "It must have fallen off in the garden." Mrs. Harcourt's voice was icy. Careless, Evelyn, and convenient, don't you think?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained serene. The ring, like the cufflink, was another piece of evidence placed too perfectly. She thought of Miss Grey's confession, Weston's presence in the garden, the tray, the envelope. The truth was close, but it required one final push to break through the lies. As the clock struck 10:30 p.m., Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind a whirl of connections. The emotional turning point had come, and with it a glimpse of the truth. She murmured to herself, "The heart betrays what the mind conceals." And now the stage is set. Chapter 9. The Tangled Web Unravels. The night of October 14th, 1955, enveloped Bertram's hotel in a hush, broken only by the occasional patter of rain against the windows. The lounge, with its soft glow of lamps and elegant furnishings, seemed to pulse with anticipation, as if the walls themselves sensed the mystery nearing its climax. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her corner with her knitting, felt the weight of the moment. The ring inscribed to E.G. with love, Miss Grey's confession, and the mountain evidence against Mr. Caldwell had brought the tangled web of lies into sharp focus. Miss Marple knew that the truth was close, hidden in the interplay of motives and misdirections, waiting for her to pull the final thread. The guests, weary from days of confinement and suspicion, were gathered in the lounge, their faces etched with tension. Colonel Bantry, his newspaper forgotten, stared into the fire, his jaw tight. Miss Clara Winthrop, her gold bangle glinting, twisted it nervously, her eyes darting to Miss Grey, who sat alone, her hands clasped tightly. Mr. Ernest Caldwell, though released, remained a shadow of himself, his gaze haunted by the accusations against him. Mrs. Lavinia Harcourt, her imperious air frayed, watched Miss Grey with a cold intensity, while Mr. Weston, ever the polished manager, moved among them. His smile strained, his hand brushing his pocket watch with increasing frequency. At 11 p.m., Inspector Davis entered the lounge, his face grim but resolute. "We've made significant progress," he announced, his voice cutting through the silence. "Miss Grey, your ring places you in the garden near the time of the murder, and your presence in the library during Mr. Pennington's call raises questions. I'd like you to come with us for further questioning." Miss Grey's face crumpled, tears welling in her eyes. "I've told you everything," she cried, her voice breaking. "I didn't do anything. I only overheard Mr. Pennington. I didn't kill him." Mrs. Harcourt's voice was sharp. "Evelyn, your histrionics are tiresome. If you're innocent, stop acting so guilty." Colonel Bantry stood, his military bearing restored. "Now see here, Inspector, you're hounding the poor girl. That ring could have been lost days ago, just like Caldwell's cufflink. You're chasing shadows." Miss Marple's needles paused, though they were in her bag. The room was at a boiling point, and she sensed an opportunity to nudge the truth into the open. She rose, her manner gentle but commanding, and addressed the group. "If I may, Inspector, I believe we're all missing a piece of the puzzle. The clues, the cufflink, the ring, the note, the vial, are all threads, but they've been woven to mislead us. Might I suggest we consider Mr. Weston's movements on the day of the murder?" The room fell silent, all eyes turning to the manager, whose smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth but strained, "I've accounted for my time. I was in my office at 3:30, as I told the inspector." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Indeed, Mr. Weston. but Colonel Bantry saw you with a tray just before the scream, and Miss Grey saw you in the garden, near the rose bed, and that pocket watch of yours. It seems to occupy your attention rather often. Might it hold a secret, perhaps?" Weston's hand froze on his watch, his composure cracking. "I don't know what you're implying, Miss Marple. I'm merely a manager, doing my duty." Miss Marple turned to Inspector Davis, her tone deferential. "Inspector, might I suggest examining Mr. Weston's watch? It's a small thing, but in my experience, small things often hide great truths." Davis hesitated, then nodded. "Very well. Mr. Weston, may I see your watch?" Weston's face paled, but he handed over the pocket watch, his movements reluctant. Davis opened it, revealing a small compartment behind the face. Inside was a folded piece of paper, its edges worn. The inspector unfolded it, his brow furrowing as he read aloud, "Meet me at 3:30 dining room." P.A. gasp rippled through the room. Mrs. Harcourt's eyes narrowed, and Miss Grey's hands flew to her mouth. Caldwell, his voice hoarse, said, "That's Pennington's writing." But why would he meet Weston? Miss Marple's voice was calm, but firm. Mr. Pennington, it seems, was orchestrating a scheme, perhaps blackmail, perhaps a financial deal, that threatened several people here. His phone call, overheard by Miss Grey, mentioned Harcourt and Grey, and papers that would finish someone. "Mr. Weston, you were in the garden, perhaps to retrieve something incriminating, and your tray, seen by Colonel Bantry, may have carried the poisoned wine." Weston's face hardened, but his voice remained steady. "This is absurd. I had no reason to harm Pennington. That note could mean anything." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes piercing. "Perhaps, but the mud on the dining room carpet, the shred of fabric in the garden, the tray, the note, all point to you. And Miss Grey's ring, so conveniently found near the cufflink, suggests someone was planting evidence to shift blame. You were seen in the garden, Mr. Weston, and your absence at 3:30 aligns perfectly with the time of death." The room was silent, the tension palpable. Inspector Davis stepped forward, his voice stern. "Mr. Weston, I'll need you to come with us. We'll verify this note and your movements." Weston's composure shattered, his voice rising. "You can't believe this old woman. She's spinning tales. I'm innocent." But Miss Grey, her voice trembling, spoke up. I saw him, Inspector. In the garden, he was holding something, a small bottle, I think. I didn't want to say anything, but I'm sure of it now." Mrs. Harcourt's face darkened. "Evelyn, you foolish girl! Why didn't you speak sooner?" Miss Grey's tears flowed freely. "I was afraid, ma'am. Mr. Weston, he said he'd protect me, but I think he was using me." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her expression remained serene. The truth was emerging, as she had known it would. She turned to Inspector Davis. "You might also examine the pantry, Inspector. The vial Mary showed me, a sedative, she claimed, may have been tampered with. And the envelope Miss Grey took from the library might contain the papers Pennington mentioned." Davis nodded, his face set. "We'll look into it, Miss Marple. Mr. Weston, you're coming with us now." As Weston was led away, protesting, the lounge erupted in murmurs. Colonel Bantry shook his head, muttering, "Never would have thought it." Miss Winthrop clutched her bangle, her face pale. Caldwell's shoulders sagged with relief, though his eyes remained wary. Mrs. Harcourt's gaze was unreadable, but Miss Grey's tears had stopped, replaced by a quiet resolve. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly. The web was unravelling, but a few threads remained loose. The envelope, the vial, the full extent of Pennington's scheme. She would leave those to the police, but she had no doubt they would confirm her suspicions. She thought of her village, where human nature played out in simpler ways, but with the same motives: greed, fear, betrayal. As the clock struck midnight, Miss Marple murmured to herself, "The truth, like a well-knit scarf, requires patience and care, and now it is nearly complete." Chapter 10. The Truth Revealed. The early hours of October 15th, 1955, found Bertram's hotel steeped in an uneasy calm, the mist outside its windows thinning to reveal a pale dawn. The lounge, though still elegant, bore the weight of the previous night's revelations, its air thick with the aftershock of Mr. Weston's detention. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her familiar corner with her knitting, felt the mystery reaching its resolution. The note in Weston's pocket watch, Miss Grey's confession, and the mounting evidence had unravelled the web of lies, but a final piece remained to confirm the truth. Her needles clicked softly, a steady rhythm as she pieced together the last threads of the puzzle. The guests, exhausted by days of suspicion, were subdued as they gathered for breakfast. Colonel Bantry, his bluster restored, muttered about the incompetence of the police, though his eyes betrayed relief. Miss Clara Winthrop, her gold bangle glinting, seemed less nervous, as if the shift in suspicion had lifted a burden. Mr. Ernest Caldwell, though still pale, sat with a straighter posture, his ordeal nearing an end. Mrs. Lavinia Harcourt's imperious air had softened, her gaze less accusing, while Miss Evelyn Grey, her face drawn but resolute, avoided looking at the empty space where Mr. Weston usually stood. The absence of the manager cast a shadow over the room, a reminder of the truth that was emerging. At 8:30 a.m., Inspector Davis entered the lounge, his face weary but triumphant, accompanied by Sergeant Finch, who carried a small evidence box. "We've concluded our investigation," Davis announced, his voice steady. "Thanks to Miss Marple's insights, we've uncovered the truth about Mr. Pennington's murder. Mr. Weston has confessed." A collective gasp filled the room. Colonel Bantry's coffee cup paused mid-air, and Miss Winthrop's bangle clinked against her saucer. Caldwell's shoulders sagged with relief, while Mrs. Harcourt's eyes narrowed, her expression unreadable. Miss Grey's hands trembled, but she remained silent, her eyes fixed on the floor. Davis continued, "The note found in Mr. Weston's watch was written by Mr. Pennington, arranging a meeting in the private dining room at 3:30 p.m. The envelope Miss Grey retrieved from the library contained documents detailing a blackmail scheme. Pennington was pressuring Mr. Weston, threatening to expose his involvement in a financial fraud at the hotel, a scheme that also implicated Mrs. Harcourt's late husband. Weston, desperate to protect his reputation, poisoned the wine with cyanide from a vial he disguised as a sedative, which he later planted in the pantry to cast suspicion on Mary. Miss Marple's needles paused, though they were in her bag. She had suspected as much, but the confirmation was satisfying. She spoke softly, her voice carrying a quiet authority. "And the cufflink, Inspector? The ring, the shred of fabric?" Davis nodded, acknowledging her contribution. "The cufflink was taken from Mr. Caldwell's room. Weston admitted to planting it in the garden to frame him. knowing of Caldwell's past disputes with Pennington. The ring belonging to Miss Grey was another misdirection, dropped in the garden to confuse the timeline. The shred of fabric was from Miss Grey's coat, torn accidentally as she fled the garden after seeing Weston there. She wasn't involved, but her fear kept her silent. Miss Grey's voice broke the silence, trembling but clear. "I was so afraid. I thought Mr. Weston was protecting me, but he was using me to cover his tracks. I'm sorry I didn't speak sooner." Mrs. Harcourt's tone was cold but softer than before. "You should have trusted me, Evelyn. But I understand. Pennington was a vile man, and his schemes hurt us all." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. She thought of the torn napkin, the scratch in the library, the ink stain, all small details that had pointed to a larger truth. Weston, she realized, had been meticulous but not flawless. His tray, seen by Colonel Bantry, had carried the poisoned wine, and his presence in the garden, witnessed by Miss Grey, had betrayed his attempt to retrieve the vial he'd dropped. The note in his watch, meant to be destroyed, had been his undoing. Colonel Bantry cleared his throat, his voice gruff. "Well, Miss Marple, you've outdone the lot of us. I'd have never pegged Weston for a murderer. Too polished by half." Miss Winthrop, her voice soft, added, "I thought it was Mr. Caldwell, with all that evidence. But you saw through it, Miss Marple." Caldwell, his face still pale, managed a nod. "I owe you my thanks, ma'am. I thought I was done for." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles resuming their rhythm. "It's merely a matter of observation, my dears. People are much the same, whether in a village or a grand hotel. Their motives, greed, fear, desperation, are universal." Inspector Davis approached her, his tone respectful. "You've got a sharp mind, Miss Marple. We'd have been chasing Caldwell for weeks without you. The vial in the pantry has been tested. It was indeed cyanide, disguised as a sedative. And the papers in the envelope confirm Pennington's blackmail. Weston's confessed to everything, even the mud on the carpet. He tracked it in through the dining-room window to avoid the hall." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. "Thank you, Inspector. I'm glad the truth has come to light." As the guests dispersed, their relief palpable, Miss Marple remained in her corner, her knitting a steady companion. The lounge seemed lighter, as if the shadow over Bertram's had lifted. She thought of her village, St. Mary Mead, where human nature played out in simpler ways, but with the same patterns of deceit and redemption. The clues, the napkin, the cufflink, the ring, the note, had been threads in a tapestry, and she had woven them together with patience and care. At 10 a.m., as the guests prepared to leave the hotel, freed from their confinement, Miss Grey approached Miss Marple, her eyes clear for the first time. "Thank you, Miss Marple," she said softly. "You believed in me when no one else did." Miss Marple patted her hand. "My dear, the truth always finds a way, if one looks closely enough." As the clock struck 11 a.m., Miss Marple gathered her knitting and rose, ready to return to her quiet life. The case was closed, the truth revealed, and Bertram's hotel would soon regain its elegance, untainted by murder. She murmured to herself, "A stitch in time saves 9, and a truth in time saves all." Chapter 11. After the storm. The morning of October 15th, 1955, brought a fragile clarity to Bertram's hotel. As if the pale sunlight streaming through the windows sought to cleanse the lingering shadows of the past few days. The lounge, with its gleaming silver and plush armchairs, was slowly reclaiming its air of refined tranquillity, though the echoes of the murder and its resolution still hung in the air. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual corner with her knitting, felt a quiet satisfaction. The truth about Mr. Weston's crime had been revealed. The tangled web of lies unravelled, and the guests were free to leave. Yet, as always, she knew that the aftermath of such events left its own delicate threads to be tidied. The guests, now released from the confines of suspicion, moved with a mix of relief and unease. Colonel Bantry, his military bearing restored, was packing his bags, eager to return to his country estate. Miss Clara Winthrop, her gold bangle catching the light, seemed lighter, though her diamond bracelet remained absent. A mystery Miss Marple suspected might involve a jeweller's shop rather than foul play. Mr. Ernest Caldwell, his reputation restored, was preparing to depart for London, his face still marked by the ordeal, but his eyes brighter with gratitude. Mrs. Lavinia Harcourt, her composure fully regained, sat with a cup of tea, her expression thoughtful rather than imperious. Miss Evelyn Grey, though still pale, carried herself with a newfound resolve, as if unburdened by the secrets she had carried. At 11:30 a.m., Miss Marple joined the guests for a final tea in the lounge, a gesture of closure orchestrated by the hotel's temporary manager, a young assistant who lacked Mr. Weston's polish, but made up for it with earnest effort. The atmosphere was subdued but warm, the guests exchanging polite farewells as they prepared to resume their lives. Colonel Bantry approached Miss Marple, his voice gruff but warm. "You've done us a great service, Miss Marple. I'll be telling Dolly all about this when I get home. She'll want to hear every detail. You're a marvel, you know." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles clicking softly. "You're very kind, Colonel. I only did what anyone might, given a bit of observation and a touch of patience." Miss Winthrop, hovering nearby, added, "I was so sure it was Mr. Caldwell, or even poor Evelyn, but you saw the truth all along. I suppose I should confess my bracelet wasn't at the jeweller's. I sold it to settle some debts Mr. Pennington pressured me into. I was too ashamed to say." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with understanding. "My dear, there's no shame in honesty. You've learned a lesson, and that's worth more than any bracelet." Mrs. Harcourt, overhearing, set down her teacup with a gentle clink. "Miss Marple, you've a gift for seeing through facades. I owe Evelyn an apology. I was too hard on her. Pennington's schemes touched us all, and I let my anger blind me." Miss Grey, standing nearby, offered a shy smile. "It's all right, ma'am. I should have spoken up sooner. Miss Marple helped me find my courage." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. "Courage is often a quiet thing, my dear. You did well." As the tea concluded, Inspector Davis approached, his notebook tucked away, his face softened by gratitude. "Miss Marple, I've spoken with the Chief Constable, and he's most impressed with your help. We've recovered the full set of documents from the envelope. Pennington was indeed blackmailing Weston, using evidence of the fraud to extort money. The vial was the final piece. It was cyanide, as you suspected, disguised to look like Mary's sedative. Weston's confession has tied up every loose end." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Thank you, Inspector. I'm glad justice has been served. And Mary, How is she faring?" Davis's expression softened further. "She's shaken but relieved. She had no idea the file was tampered with. Weston used her as a pawn, knowing her nervousness would make her seem suspicious. She's been cleared, and the hotel's keeping her on." Miss Marple's needles clicked, a sound of quiet approval. She thought of the torn napkin, the library scratch, the shred of fabric, all small details that had pointed to Weston's guilt. His careful plan had unravelled because of one flaw. He underestimated the power of observation. She recalled her village, St. Mary Mead, where a misplaced word or a nervous glance could reveal as much as a signed confession. At noon, as the guests began to depart, Miss Marple took a final stroll through the hotel's garden, where the rose bed no longer held secrets. The path, once marked by mud and misdirection, was pristine in the morning light. She paused by the dining-room window, now securely latched, and thought of the tray Weston had carried, the poisoned wine, the note in his watch. Each clue had been a stitch in the fabric of the truth, and she had sewn them together with care. Returning to the lounge, she found Miss Grey waiting, a small parcel in her hands. "Miss Marple," she said softly, "I wanted to give you this, a token of thanks. It's just a scarf, but I knitted it myself." Miss Marple accepted the parcel, her eyes warm. "How thoughtful, my dear. I shall treasure it." As the clock struck 1 p.m., Miss Marple gathered her belongings, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. The hotel staff, now under new management, bustled about, restoring order. The guests, their burdens lifted, said their goodbyes. And Bertram's hotel began to reclaim its elegance, the shadow of murder fading like a bad dream. Miss Marple stepped into the waiting taxi, her mind already turning to the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead. The case had reminded her of an old spinster in her village, whose sharp tongue hid a kind heart, much like Mrs. Harcourt. It had reminded her, too, of a young maid who had once confessed to a theft, only to be forgiven when the truth emerged. Human nature, she thought, was the same everywhere, whether in a grand hotel or a humble cottage. As the taxi pulled away, she murmured to herself, "The world is full of patterns, and a careful eye can always find the truth within them." Chapter 12. The Return to St. Mary Mead. The afternoon of October 15th, 1955, saw Miss Jane Marple settled comfortably in the train compartment, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels a soothing counterpoint to the quiet satisfaction in her heart. Bertram's hotel, with its grand facade and hidden secrets, was now a memory fading into the London skyline. Her knitting bag rested on the seat beside her, the scarf from Miss Evelyn Grey tucked carefully inside, a memento of a case well solved. The murder of Mr. Pennington, the web of lies woven by Mr. Weston, and the delicate threads of human nature had all been unravelled, leaving Miss Marple with a sense of closure. Tempered by her usual reflections on the complexities of the human heart. As the countryside rolled past, its green fields and hedgerows a stark contrast to the polished elegance of the hotel, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to St. Mary Mead. Her little village, with its gossip and quiet dramas, seemed a world away from the grandeur of Bertram's. Yet the motives she had uncovered, greed, fear, desperation, were as familiar there as they had been in London. She smiled faintly, her needles idle in her lap, as she considered how the case had echoed incidents for her village. The time Mrs. Price's nephew had been wrongly accused of theft, or the scandal over Mr. Hodges' forged will. Human nature, she mused, was a universal tapestry, its patterns repeating across time and place. At 3 p.m., the train pulled into the small station near St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple stepped onto the platform, her knitting bag in hand. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves, and she felt a wave of comfort at the familiar sight of the village's sleepy streets. As she walked toward her cottage, she passed Mrs. Price, who waved enthusiastically from her garden gate. "Miss Marple, back from London, are you?" Mrs. Price called, her curiosity barely contained. "I hear there was quite a to-do at that fancy hotel. Murder, no less. You must tell me all about it." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, but her tone was gentle. "Oh, Mrs. Price, it was merely a sad affair, quickly sorted. I'll pop by for tea soon, and we'll have a proper chat." Mrs. Price nodded, clearly eager for details. And Miss Marple continued on, her steps light despite the weight of her recent experiences. At her cottage, the roses by the gate were still blooming, a cheerful welcome. She unlocked the door, set her bag on the hall table, and began to unpack, her mind still turning over the events at Bertram's. As she arranged Miss Grey's scarf on a shelf, she thought of the young woman's courage, so like that of her own maid, Cherry, who had once confessed a small indiscretion with a similar tremor of fear. She thought, too, of Mrs. Harcourt, whose sharp exterior hid a vulnerability not unlike that of Miss Elspeth McGillicuddy, a friend from St. Mary Mead, who masked her kindness with brisk efficiency. Even Colonel Bantry reminded her of the vicar, with his bluster hiding a loyal heart. The parallels were comforting, a reminder that the world, for all its complexities, was bound by familiar threads. At 4:30 p.m., Miss Marple settled into her favourite armchair by the fire, a cup of tea in hand, and her knitting resumed. The quiet of her cottage was a balm after the tension of the hotel, and she allowed herself a moment of reflection. The case had been a challenge, with its false clues, the cufflink, the ring, the vial, all designed to mislead. Yet it was the small details, the torn napkin, the scratch in the library, the note in Weston's watch, that had led her to the truth. She recalled her conversation with Inspector Davis, his gratitude a quiet acknowledgement of her skill, and she smiled at the thought that even a Scotland Yard inspector could benefit from a spinster's observations. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, and she opened it to find Cherry, her maid, with a basket of scones from the village bakery. "Welcome home, Miss Marple," Cherry said, her grin wide. "The whole village is buzzing about your trip. They say you solved a murder in London. Is it true?" Miss Marple chuckled, ushering her in. "Oh, Cherry, you know how stories grow. It was merely a matter of paying attention to the right things. Now tell me, what's been happening in St. Mary Mead while I've been away?" As Cherry launched into a lively account of village gossip, a dispute over a garden fence, a missing cat, a rumoured engagement, Miss Marple listened with her usual attentiveness, her needles clicking in rhythm. The scandals of St. Mary Mead were smaller than those of Bertram's hotel, but they were no less human, no less revealing. She thought of Mr. Weston, whose polished exterior had hidden a desperate heart, and of Miss Grey, whose fear had given way to courage. Each had a counterpart in her village, a reminder that the world was a mirror, reflecting the same truths in different settings. By 6 p.m., as the light faded and the fire crackled, Miss Marple felt a deep contentment. The case was closed, the guilty punished, and the innocent freed. Her cottage, with its familiar comforts, was a haven, and she looked forward to the quiet days ahead, though she knew another mystery would inevitably find her. Human nature, after all, was never at rest. She murmured to herself, "The world spins on, and so do its stories. But a careful hand can always find the pattern." Chapter 13. A Quiet Reflection. The evening of October 15th, 1955, settled over St. Mary Mead with a gentle hush, the golden light of autumn fading into a soft twilight. Miss Jane Marple's cottage, with its cosy fire and familiar comforts, was a haven of peace after the turmoil of Bertram's hotel. She sat in her armchair, her knitting in her lap, the needles moving with their steady rhythm as she reflected on the case that had so recently consumed her. The scarf from Miss Evelyn Grey, now draped over the back of a chair, was a tangible reminder of the lives she had touched and the truth she had uncovered. Yet, as always, Miss Marple's thoughts turned not only to the resolution, but to the deeper currents of human nature that had shaped the events. The village was quiet, its usual hum of gossip subdued as the day drew to a close. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind wandering back to the grand rooms of Bertram's hotel, where elegance had masked deceit. The murder of Mr. Pennington, the calculated misdirections of Mr. Weston, and the fears and secrets of the guests had woven a complex tapestry, one she had unravelled with patience and observation. She thought of the small details, the torn napkin, the scratch in the library, the note in the pocket watch, that had led her to the truth. Each had been a clue, insignificant on its own, but vital when seen as part of the whole. As the clock struck 7 p.m., Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the people she had met. Miss Grey, with her quiet courage, reminded her of a young woman in St. Mary Mead who had once stood up to a bullying employer, her voice trembling but resolute. Mrs. Harcourt's sharp exterior, softened by the case's end, echoed old Mrs. Clement, whose stern demeanour hid a generous heart. Even Mr. Weston, the murderer, had his counterpart in a village shopkeeper who, years ago, had cheated his customers out of desperation, only to confess when cornered. The patterns of human behaviour, Miss Marple mused, were as predictable as the stitches in her knitting, yet each case brought its own unique variations. A soft knock at the door broke her reverie, and she opened it to find Miss Elspeth McGillicuddy, her friend from the village, bundled in a coat against the evening chill. "Jane, I heard you were back," Elspeth said, her eyes bright with curiosity. "The village is all aflutter about your London adventure. A murder at Bertram's hotel. You must tell me everything." Miss Marple smiled, ushering her friend inside. "Come in, Elspeth, and have some tea. It's a long story, but not so different from the little dramas we have here. Will you look closely?" As they settled by the fire, Miss Marple recounted the case in her quiet, measured way, omitting no detail, but softening the harsher edges. She spoke of the cufflink, the ring, the vial, and the note, weaving the story with the care of a storyteller who knows the power of a well-told tale. Elspeth listened, rapt, interrupting only to exclaim, "Well, I never! And you saw through it all, Jane, just like you did with that business at the vicarage." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "It's all a matter of noticing, Elspeth. People reveal themselves in the smallest ways. A glance, a word, a hesitation. At Bertram's, it was no different from Saint. Mary Mead. Elspeth nodded, her expression thoughtful. You've a gift, Jane, but doesn't it weigh on you, seeing all that darkness and people? Miss Marple's needles paused, and she considered the question. It does at times, she admitted, but there's light too, courage, kindness, redemption. Miss Grey found her voice, and even Mrs. Harcourt softened in the end. People are complex, Elspeth, and that's what makes them worth understanding. As Elspeth left, promising to spread the tale with suitable discretion, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her thoughts drifting to the broader world. Bertram's hotel had been a microcosm, a stage where human nature played out its timeless dramas. She thought of Inspector Davis, whose respect had warmed her, and of Colonel Bantry, whose gruff loyalty mirrored her own village friends. Even the hotel itself, with its polished surface hiding secrets, was not unlike the cottages of St. Mary Mead, where every door concealed a story. By 9 p.m., the fire had burned low, and Miss Marple set her knitting aside. She rose to close the curtains, pausing to look out at the quiet village street, where lamplight glowed softly in the dusk. The case was truly over, its echoes fading into the rhythm of her life. She knew, however, that St. Mary Mead would soon present its own mysteries. A missing heirloom, a whispered scandal, a misunderstanding among neighbours. And she would be ready, her sharp eyes and quiet wisdom ever at the service of truth. As she prepared for bed, she murmured to herself, Life is a pattern, and every thread has its place. One only needs to see it clearly. Chapter 14. The Echoes of Truth. The morning of October 16th, 1955, dawned bright over St. Mary Mead, the autumn sun casting long shadows across the village's tidy lanes. Miss Jane Marple's cottage, with its rose-covered gate and neatly trimmed hedges, stood as a quiet sentinel of order amidst the gentle chaos of village life. Inside, Miss Marple sat at her small writing desk, penning a letter to her nephew, Raymond West, to share a brief account of her recent adventure at Bertram's hotel. Her knitting lay nearby, the scarf from Miss Evelyn Grey, a soft reminder of the case that had unfolded and resolved in London. As she wrote, her mind wandered, reflecting not only on the murder and its resolution, but on the ripples it had left behind, like pebbles dropped in a still pond. The village was stirring, its usual rhythm of gossip and small dramas resuming. From her window, Miss Marple could see Mrs. Price bustling toward the post office, no doubt eager to share the latest whispers about her London trip. The case at Bertram's had been a grand affair, but here in St. Mary Mead, it was already becoming a legend, embellished with each retelling. Miss Marple smiled, knowing how stories grew in the telling, much like the threads of a mystery grew clearer with careful attention. At 10 a.m., she set aside her letter and took her morning walk, her knitting bag tucked under her arm as a matter of habit. The village green was alive with activity, children playing, the vicar chatting with a parishioner, and the postman making his rounds. As she passed the bakery, Cherry emerged, her arms full of fresh loaves, and waved cheerfully. "Morning, Miss Marple," Cherry called. "Mrs. Price says you're a hero in London now. Solved a murder single-handed, she says." Miss Marple chuckled, her eyes twinkling. "Oh, Cherry, you know better than to believe Mrs. Price's tales. It was merely a matter of noticing what others overlooked. Now tell me, how's that young man of yours?" Cherry blushed, launching into a lively update about her sweetheart's latest antics. and Miss Marple listened with her usual warmth, her mind noting the parallels to Miss Grey's quiet courage. The village, like Bertram's hotel, was a tapestry of human stories, each thread revealing a truth about the heart. Returning to her cottage at 11 a.m., Miss Marple found a letter waiting on the doorstep, its postmark from London. She opened it carefully, recognizing the neat handwriting of Inspector Davis. The letter was brief but warm, thanking her once more for her assistance in the Pennington case. It included a small update. Mr. Weston had been formally charged with murder, and the documents from the envelope had revealed a wider network of financial fraud, implicating several of Pennington's associates. The hotel, under new management, was recovering its reputation, and Mary, the maid, had been promoted to a supervisory role, her innocence fully vindicated. Miss Marple set the letter down, her thoughts drifting to the clues that had unravelled the case: the torn napkin, the library scratch, the cufflink, the ring. Each had been a small detail, easily dismissed, yet together they had formed a pattern as clear as the stitches in her knitting. She thought of Mr. Weston's desperation, driven by the fear of exposure, and of Miss Grey's fear, which had kept her silent until the truth could no longer be contained. Even Mrs. Harcourt's sharp words had softened, revealing a woman wounded by betrayal, but capable of forgiveness. At noon, Miss Marple decided to visit the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, was hosting a small tea for the Women's Institute. The gathering was lively, the conversation buzzing with talk of the Harvest Festival, and a minor scandal involving a missing church donation. As Miss Marple sipped her tea, Mrs. Clement leaned in, her voice low. "Jane, I hear you've been playing detective again," she said, her eyes sparkling. "London, no less. You must tell us how you did it." Miss Marple smiled, deflecting with her usual modesty. "It was nothing so grand, my dear. Just a matter of listening and watching, as we do here in St. Mary Mead. People are much the same, whether in a hotel or a village." Mrs. Clement nodded, unconvinced but fond. "You're too humble, Jane, but I'll wager you've got a story or two to share." Miss Marple promised to tell the tale another day, her mind already noting the similarities between the church donation mystery and the misdirections at Bertram's. A missing coin here, a planted cufflink there. Both were threads in the same fabric, woven by human hands and unravelled by careful observation. By 2 p.m. she returned home, her steps slow but steady. The cottage was quiet, the fire low, and she settled into her armchair with her knitting. As her needles clicked, she thought of the broader world beyond St. Mary Mead, where grand hotels and quiet villages alike were stages for human drama. The case at Bertram's had been a reminder of the power of small things. A glance, a word, a misplaced object to reveal the truth. It had also been a reminder of the resilience of those caught in the web, like Miss Grey, who had found her voice, and Mr. Caldwell, who had reclaimed his honour. As the afternoon faded into evening, Miss Marple opened her knitting bag, pulling out the scarf from Miss Grey. Its soft wool and careful stitches were a testament to the young woman's gratitude, and Miss Marple draped it over her shoulders, feeling its warmth. She thought of the lives touched by the case, the secrets laid bare, and the justice served. The echoes of truth, she knew, would linger, not only in the halls of Bertram's, but in the quiet corners of her own heart. At 5 p.m., As the sun dipped below the horizon, Miss Marple rose to light a lamp, her cottage glowing with a gentle warmth. The world outside was ever-changing, but St. Mary Mead remained her anchor, a place where she could watch and listen, ready for the next mystery to unfold. She murmured to herself, "Truth leaves echoes, and a quiet heart can hear them all." Chapter 15. A new thread begins. The morning of October 17th, 1955, greeted St. Mary Mead with a crisp clarity. The autumn air carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves. Miss Jane Marple's cottage, nestled among its blooming roses, stood as a beacon of quiet order in the village's gentle bustle. She sat at her breakfast table, a cup of tea steaming beside her, her knitting resting nearby with the scarf from Miss Evelyn Grey neatly folded atop it. The Bertram's hotel case was now a closed chapter, its echoes fading, but Miss Marple's sharp mind was ever alert, sensing that the rhythms of St. Mary Mead would soon weave a new mystery for her to unravel. The village was alive with its usual hum, the postman's bicycle rattling along the lane, children laughing on their way to school, and the faint chime of the church bell marking the hour. Miss Marple, finishing her toast, glanced at the morning's post, which included a letter from her nephew, Raymond West, expressing delight at her account of the Bertram's affair, and promising a visit soon. She smiled, knowing Raymond would embellish the tale with his writer's flair. But her thoughts were interrupted by a faint unease, a prickle of intuition that something in the village was amiss. At 9:30 a.m., Miss Marple set out for a walk, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, her eyes taking in the familiar sights of St. Mary Mead. As she passed the vicarage, she noticed Mrs. Clement in the garden, her face unusually troubled as she clipped roses. Miss Marple paused, her instinct for human nature as keen as ever. "Good morning, Mrs. Clement," she called, her voice gentle. "You seem a bit preoccupied today. Is everything all right?" Mrs. Clement sighed, setting down her shears. "Oh, Jane, it's this business with the church donations. Another sum went missing yesterday. 10 shillings, not much, but it's the second time this month. The vicar's beside himself, and people are starting to whisper about young Tom, the new altar boy. I don't believe it, but, well, you know how gossip spreads." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained serene. "Indeed I do. Gossip is like a dropped stitch, easy to start, but it takes care to mend. Perhaps I could have a word with Tom, if it would help." Mrs. Clement's face brightened. "Would you, Jane? You've such a way with these things. I'd hate to see the boy unfairly blamed." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already turning over the details. A missing sum, a young boy under suspicion, whispers in the village. It was a small matter compared to the murder at Bertram's, but no less revealing of human nature. She thought of the planted cufflink in the hotel garden, the misdirections that had clouded the truth, and wondered if this new puzzle held similar deceptions. At 10:30 a.m., she found Tom, a lanky boy of 15 sweeping the church steps, his face clouded with worry. She approached with her usual warmth, her knitting bag a comforting prop. "Good morning, Tom," she said, her voice kind. "I hear there's been some trouble with the donations. Would you like to tell me about it? Sometimes talking helps clear things up." Tom's eyes darted nervously, but Miss Marple's gentle gaze steadied him. "I didn't take it, Miss Marple, I swear," he said, his voice cracking. I counted the collection myself, and it was all there Sunday night. But yesterday, when Mrs. Clement checked, 10 shillings were gone. They think I did it because I was alone in the vestry for a bit." Miss Marple nodded, her mind noting the boy's sincerity, much like Miss Grey's trembling honesty at Bertram's. "I believe you, Tom, but tell me, who else was in the church that evening? Anyone unusual?" Tom hesitated, then said, "Well, Mr. Hodge was there, tidying the hymnals, and I saw Mrs. Price's nephew, Jim, near the vestry door. He's been hanging about a lot lately, ever since he came back from London." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained calm. Jim, Mrs. Price's nephew, had a reputation for small troubles, petty thefts, minor debts, much like Mr. Weston's hidden desperation. She thought of the library scratch at Bertram's, a tiny clue that had pointed to a larger truth, and wondered if the vestry held a similar detail. "Thank you, Tom," she said, patting his arm. "You've been very helpful. Don't worry, we'll sort this out." Returning to her cottage at noon, Miss Marple sat at her desk, her knitting idle, as she jotted down notes. The missing donations, Tom's innocence, Jim's presence. It was a whodunit pattern forming, faint but familiar. She recalled the Bertram's case, where small clues had revealed a grand scheme, and decided to visit the church herself, hoping to find a detail overlooked. At 1 p.m., she slipped into the vestry, her steps soft on the stone floor. The room was tidy, the collection box locked, but her sharp eyes caught a faint smudge on the edge of the table, a trace of wax, as if a candle had been knocked over. She bent closer, noting a tiny scrap of paper caught in a crack, bearing a single word, debt. It was a whisper of a clue, but Miss Marple knew whispers could lead to shouts. As she left the church, she encountered Mrs. Price, who was hurrying toward the village shop. "Miss Marple," she called, her voice eager. "Any news on that church business? I heard Tom's in trouble again." Miss Marple smiled, deflecting gently. "Nothing certain yet, Mrs. Price. But tell me, how's your nephew Jim? He's been back from London, hasn't he?" Mrs. Price's face tightened slightly. "Oh, Jim's fine. Just settling in. Why do you ask?" "Just curious," Miss Marple replied, her tone light but her eyes searching. "He's been seen near the church, I hear." Mrs. Price hurried off, her expression uneasy, and Miss Marple's mind clicked like her needles. Jim, the wax smudge, the word debt. The threads were aligning, much like the cufflink and the note at Bertram's. She suspected Jim might be involved, perhaps driven by financial troubles, as Weston had been by blackmail. By 3 p.m., Miss Marple returned home, her knitting resumed as she pondered her next step. She would speak to Jim gently, as she had with Miss Grey, and watch for the small signs, a nervous glance, a hesitant word that betrayed the truth. The village, like Bertram's hotel, was a stage for human drama, and she was ready to play her part. As the afternoon light softened, she murmured to herself, "Every mystery is a new thread, and a careful hand can weave it into truth."